5.6 The Nobles and the Common People of Mecca. At first the Prophet ﷺ used to sit with the few people who believed beside the Kaaba, teaching them the words of Allah. Many of them were clients and slaves who were considered of much lower rank than Quraysh. The dignitaries of Quraysh were willing to sit and amuse themselves by what the Prophet ﷺ had to say, perhaps even to catch some gems of wisdom such as poets and bards repeated. They were as yet unaware of the gravity of the message or the power of the truth that was to pull down their whole social and economic system and give them a new life-giving faith. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was one of them, but to sit in the same place with such common people was unthinkable to them, beneath their dignity and an affront to their illustrious persons. One day they asked the messenger to disperse these people so that they could sit with him and hear what he had to say. The Prophet ﷺ, though modest and kind-hearted, had been brought up in Qurayshi tradition, where people were clearly divided into masters and slaves. Also, he wanted desperately to make the leaders of the Quraysh believe, for if they did, the whole of Mecca would follow. He was about to acquiesce to their wishes when the following verses were revealed. And do not drive away those who call upon their Lord morning and evening, seeking his face. You are not charged with anything of their account, nor are they charged with anything of yours, so that you drive them away and become of the wicked. Surah 6, verse 52. These words were most shocking to the Arabs. The implications were very great. They implied that these common people had rights equal to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. If so, then they had rights equal to theirs. The holy verses continue. Thus have we tempted them with each other, so that they say, are those the ones Allah has favoured among us? Does not Allah know best who the thankful are? Surah 6, verse 53. If the common people were given precedence in faith, the nobles of Quraysh would say, is it possible that they were able to grasp the truth before us, that Allah has preferred them to us? It was a test for them that only the truly good could pass, that only the man free from arrogance and conceit would understand. Unfortunately, many of them were not free of these traits and preferred their pomp and pride to the truth. The rabble of Quraysh, at their master's instigation, began to harass and disturb the Muslims during their prayers, so the Muslims sought privacy in the mountains. Whenever they wanted to pray, they went off to the mountains. This lasted for 3 years until a young man called Al-Arqam, who had entered into Islam and who had no one living with him except his aged father, offered to make his house a meeting place for them. The house was spacious enough for the purpose, and the Prophet ﷺ accepted. Now those who entered into Islam went to this house to swear allegiance to Allah and his Messenger. Abu Bakr, who was very popular and well connected, began to call people to Allah, disregarding the danger of what Quraysh might do to his person or to disrupt his trade. Many noblemen from Quraysh entered into Islam through Abu Bakr, then went to the Prophet ﷺ to declare their allegiance and learn more about religion. The number of Muslims began to grow steadily, and the communications from Allah gradually taught them ideas and ideals far above anything their people or the world had ever known. 5.7 New Precepts. The Quran introduced the idea that all men, despite their wealth or position, were equal in the sight of Allah. This idea was completely alien to the Arabs, who prided themselves on their lineage. Each tribe was careful to record the deeds of its heroes and ancestors, and they extolled them in verse and prose. A man of unknown lineage was a nobody, and had no place among them except as a slave. The Quran pointed out that it was not a matter of lineage, wealth, or children, the things they prided themselves upon, but the purity of the heart that Allah looked at. Even a foreigner would be approved by Allah if he was a righteous man. Race, nation, tribe, and gender were of no consequence. The Holy Quran says, Mankind, we have created you male and female, nations and clans to get acquainted. To Allah the most honoured among you is the most devout. Surah 49, verse 13. Did these verses imply that their slaves could be their equals? And gender too was mentioned. Surely women were not to be compared with men. But in clear and majestic language, the Quran continued to explain that since all human beings were the descendants of Adam (salam) and Hawa, Eve, their lineage was the same. Women were individuals and had clear inalienable rights. A good woman was better than a bad man in the sight of Allah, and there was much more to shock the sensibilities of the leaders of the Quraysh. The fatherless, the widow, the slave, and all the downtrodden were discussed one by one and given rights and liberties. No one was forgotten. The Quran introduced another concept that seemed to the Arabs cowardly and degrading. The idea of forgiveness and pardon was introduced. The Arabs had prided themselves in their ability in vendettas to pursue a debt of vengeance to the death. The Quran counselled tempering vengeance by mercy. To seek redress was a human right, according to the Quran, But to forgive was better, provided that one had the ability to attain redress and did not forgive out of weakness, but rather out of benevolence and understanding, and in the firm belief that all men were brethren, and that one should forgive one's brother if he had made a mistake. As the precepts of the Quran unfolded, they began to divide the Meccans into two groups. The kind, the just, the idealistic were won over by these concepts and fought for them as the eternal truth, worth living by and worth dying for. The hard-hearted, the selfish, the narrow-minded, the arrogant began to fight them as a threat to their position in their society, their economic system, and their religion upon which their privileges and honour above other Arabs depended. It was not everyone who was ready to make sacrifices for the downtrodden. It took a man with the innate sensitivity and goodness of Abu Bakr to feel his slave his equal, and to accept the truth of this. It took a man with the deep sense of justice of Umar ibn al-Khattab to grasp the righteousness of the idea and consider it fair, or someone with the generosity of Uthman ibn Affan to accept sacrificing his privileges for the sake of the downtrodden. Many did not want to become Muslims, for the Quran stated that to be a Muslim meant to set slaves free as an act pleasing to Allah, to treat women with absolute fairness and tactful kindness, to care for orphans as if they were one's own children, and to give them their property as soon as they were old enough to manage it, to help the needy, to answer the call of the distressed, to be humble and reverential to one's aged parents, to be true in word, deed, and thought, and to pray to Allah 5 times a day. To people who lived a life of luxury and idleness based on the service of their many slaves and dependents, the daughter of Abdul Muttalib, one of the Prophet ﷺ's aunts, gave 40 of her slaves their freedom in one day. It was not a small thing to ask. To a people who thought it their right as men and masters to take the best of everything and give the weak, women, children, and slaves, whatever they would, it was indeed a sacrifice. To men whose highest pleasure was spending the night in drink, with slaves and poets extolling their greatness, their generosity, their lineage, or whatever they had done or said, it meant a totally new outlook, a very different concept of man and his relationship to his Creator. It was tantamount to starting a whole new life. Islam decreed humility before one's Maker. Allah does not like the boastful, the vainglorious. It meant contemplation of his wondrous universe and the constant attempt to reflect and understand. The ability to think was a great gift bestowed by Allah, and it was man's duty to use it. Then, above all, he was to do all the good he could, both actively by helping make the world a better place, and passively by controlling his own whims and desires. In exchange, Allah promised paradise, Jannah, to those who made the effort and worshipped him alone. What the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was asking of them was to shun the 360 idols around the Kaaba, those idols whom their fathers and forefathers had worshipped for generation after generation. What he asked was not little, indeed it was much, but the reward also was not little. It was beyond anything that man could achieve for himself. From the dark heart of Mecca, the noble, the good, the generous were being picked one by one and added to the Prophet's ﷺ little group. The influential men of Mecca looked on in wonder, then in alarm, then in fear. They felt the earth was being pulled from under their feet, and they did not like it. 5.8. Stumbling blocks. Before Islam, the religion of the Arabs had been a token sacrifice of a goat or a camel to their idols, and then doing whatever they pleased. Islam made moral and spiritual demands that they were unwilling to accept. Moreover, it introduced two concepts that their materialistic minds found very difficult to conceive. These two concepts were resurrection and the idea of reward and punishment. How could they be brought back to life after they had become dust? They found the idea impossible to accept. The Holy Quran tried to help them by pointing out how the earth seems dead, but is revived as soon as water falls upon it, and that the creation of the heavens and earth is more difficult than the creation of man, so that he who created them and man for the first time would find no difficulty in creating them a second time. Indeed, it would be easier. They took alarm at the description of the Day of Judgment and how people would be taken to account for everything they had done on earth. Their religion was very much of this world, and the idea that this world was only an introduction to the next world they found very strange. The idea of hell, Jahannam, and the punishment of the wicked was something they feared and at the same time refused to believe in. "If it is true that we shall be resurrected again," they said to the messenger, "then bring back our fathers if you are truthful." They could not perceive that if they had the material proof they demanded, where would the test of faith be?